So, is no news good news? Nothing majorly breaking came out of the rather lukewarm interview with Kamala Harris that went off without any major gaffes or so-called word salads, but still the media pounced. The Daily Beast quickly turned around a write-up of the interview that the media had been begging for, writing a blistering review of CNN's Dana Bash, who conducted the interview, writing, quote, Harris and Walz were excellent, even if Dana Bash's insipid questions merely recycled limp GOP critiques and made clear why such interviews have so little value for voters. Trump senior advisor Jason Miller gave his hot take on Newsmax this morning.
It did not look presidential. There's a certain threshold that you have to meet when you're looking presidential. Can you lead this country? Other candidates in the past have had it. I don't see that with Kamala Harris.
CNN's Michael Smerconish had a different take.
I think the headline today is that there is no headline, right? That there was really no news made from the event other than the fact that it occurred after her being, the Democratic candidate for about a month. She achieved her purpose, which is that the two of us right now are not discussing any viral video. Hippocratic oath, first rule, do no harm. It applies to politics.
Well, let's dig into the media angle here, Jessica. I want to start with the aesthetics of the interview, which were horrible. Oh. So you had this sort of boardroom looking setup. Apparently they were in some kind of restaurant or diner. And oddly, Kamala Harris was in the background of the shot, whereas Tim Walz, Dana Bash were in the foreground. They put Kamala in a gray suit. She was kind of blending in. There's this water cup down on the floor between her feet. And during one of the zoomed in shots of Kamala Harris, one of the ISO shots, you could actually see Dana Bash's papers shuffling above the chyron. So just from a visual standpoint, this was a disaster. I think whoever produced this for CNN probably ought to be at least given a rough talking to, if not fired. And then the length of it was obviously a problem. Kamala Harris only spoke for about 16 minutes herself. The interview in its entirety was obviously longer, but CNN had to stretch this out across an entire hour of programming with these sort of prepackaged videos and commercial breaks instead of just playing the whole thing through to make it look longer than it was. I think, as a journalist, if you're offered this interview, obviously you want to be the person who gets this exclusive sit down, the first one with Kamala Harris after becoming the Democratic nominee. But you should try to probably negotiate more time than 20, 30 minutes. And you should probably try to negotiate solo interviews with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And you should probably try to set up a better aesthetic shot than the one that they had. And if you're Dana Bash, you should be pushing back harder on some of these questions as opposed to just sort of teeing up the most bare minimum challenging question and then immediately moving on once the answer is given.
Yeah, Dana Bash has a hard job. If she asks questions that are critical, she's unfair. If she doesn't, then she's weak. She's going to get destroyed by the media either way from either side. And so in a sit-down interview, you want to have a conversation. And because there's so many decision makers at CNN and producers who have questions, and it's a whole network really coming up probably with these questions, I would, push back on the fact that does Dana Bash even make all of the decisions that are asked there? It's really CNN that I hold responsible for this interview going the way it did. Because if you're sitting down with someone and you're a reporter, a journalist, you want to get something out of them that does make the news, that's not something they've already said before, you're going to have to let the conversation go where it goes. Having a scripted sit-down conversation doesn't always take you to interesting places. And I think that's the lesson here. And when everyone's like, please do more media interviews, come on, Kamala Harris, I was saying they're doing it because they want to make money. They want people to be watching their network. People want to see what the presidential candidates have to say. And so, they're really criticizing her to force her into a position that's favorable to them. I saw someone post on Twitter when they said the media is saying, or Chuck Todd is saying Kamala Harris should do more interviews, do interviews one day a week. They said Chef Boyardee, Kamala Harris should eat ravioli one night a week. That's really how I see it all. But if you're going to do the sit down, you're going to get the big interview. At least make it personable. Get her to open up a little bit. And it just was so dry and sterile. And it might be where they were. You make a good point as to where CNN decided to have this sit down interview. But Tim Walz is a very different person when he's doing Subway Takes, which is a popular online interview forum. He's sitting casually. They're asking questions they don't normally ask. It's much more watchable. It gets more views. And you can still ask policy questions in a comfortable setting. Kamala Harris is a lot more lively and interesting when she's not in this sit down setting. So I don't know. I credit a lot of this to the same things I have criticisms over in regular mainstream media. It's just a bit stuffy. It's not something people want to watch anymore.
I think you're right that the motivations of the media here are suspect because they want access to the candidate, right? They started criticizing Kamala about 20, 30 days into her not giving interviews, which I think I predicted on this show was going to happen because they want this quid pro quo relationship. They want to be able to have her on their programs. But at the same time, it's also legitimate that she should have to answer to the American people off of a teleprompter. She should have to talk about her policy positions and the changes that she's made with some tough questioning. I think that's a benefit to the country and a democracy. The scripted questions were not great for doing that because it was pretty clear that Dana Bash had a list of, let's say, 10 questions that she was planning on asking these candidates, and she was not going to veer from that script. I thought that was most obvious when she questioned Tim Walz about his misrepresentations of his service record. She distilled it down to this one moment where he talked about carrying weapons in war, which gave him the opportunity to say that he merely misspoke or his wife referred to him as not having the best grammar. But the issue surrounding the Stolen Valor narrative is much greater than this one moment. It includes the fact that he continues to misrepresent his rank in the military, a rank that he never earned. It glossed over the fact that former members of his unit in the Minnesota National Guard said that he knew that they were getting deployed before he retired to run for Congress and essentially abandoned them. It glossed over the fact that there's videos from decades, from the past 15 years, where Tim Walz is introduced as a combat veteran and he nods and claps along without ever correcting them. So she really gave him the opportunity to squirm out from under what are legitimate questions about the way he's represented his service record. And my guess is it's probably never going to be asked again because other journalists are going to say, well, Dana Bash covered that, but she didn't really.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of the Tim Walz attacks have been responded to and debunked to like a nauseating degree. And so focusing on that would not be giving the American people anything new. I think Tim Walz has done a really good job being on the media circuit, doing a ton of long sit down interviews on podcasts, doing more fun online interviews with people like Subway Takes. And so I think we know who Tim Walz is. He's had to respond for this record a lot. We've seen the back and forth about, he actually did file to run for office some months before they ever got their deployment orders. He filed to run for office before there was even an inkling that his, division of the National Guard, his unit would ever potentially be deployed. And that was within the next 2 years. He made a statement that he was willing to serve the country, whether in Afghanistan or in Minnesota. And then when things got very close to the election cycle and there still weren't these orders, he decided to start the retirement process after 24 years of service. Typically, that's after 20 years. He would have been in his 40s when he was deployed, if he was. So there's questions around what he would have done if he was deployed. And so it was a violation of the Hatch Act if he was campaigning and was deployed. And so in recommendation to not break the law, he decided to retire after many years of service. I just don't think this idea that Tim Walz has stolen valor still has the momentum in the media that it used to, maybe in right-wing circles, but I think the news cycle has moved on. Something I wish Dana Bash really talked about more is what they accomplished in their records of public service. I think people want to know what someone has done so they know what they can do. And Kamala Harris is in a tough position because she's still serving as vice president to Joe Biden. So it's hard for her to say, X, Y, and Z is going to be different, or X, Y, and Z was good, X, Y, and Z was a mistake, when she's still serving with Joe Biden. And I think Joe Biden's got to give her some leeway, some permission to say, yes, I'm the transition candidate. Go tell them how we're going to progress beyond what we got done.
Yeah, there are a couple of things on the Tim Walz points that I wanted to address. The first is that his supervisor in his unit did do an interview with CNN where he said that everyone was aware of the deployment months before Tim Walz filed to run for Congress, and that he was denied his retirement, but actually went over his supervisor's head to get it through. And other members of his unit also said that they knew about the deployment well before he left. So that has not been litigated properly. He has not actually responded to any of this before this Dana Bash interview. There's been some comments from campaign officials, but Tim Walz himself has not gone on the record and talked about some of these inconsistencies, including at the convention referring to himself as a command sergeant, which is not a rank that he has earned. On your point about Harris and Biden, I think that's a good one. She did talk about the fact that she stands by her assessment of Biden's cognitive state, both pre and post debate. And yet there's obviously a disconnect here, right? If Biden were as cognitively well and capable as she says that he is, then he would have been the one sitting in that interview. He would have been the one that is the nomination for the Democratic Party. So I'm not sure how she's going to thread that needle. You're right. She's going to have a very difficult time explaining how she's going to differ from the Biden administration, which has been very unpopular with voters, while also not throwing her boss under the bus. And he's not letting her do that because he's been saying several times publicly that she was a partner in the administration, that she was supportive of Bidenomics. So that's going to be a really, really tough task that she has heading into November. We're going to have to leave it there, but we're going to be back with more Rising after this.